The brioche stitch creates this nice fluffy fabric. I don't know if you can see here those ridges, and it looks the same on both sides. It's really squishy. You need to make sure that you work your cast on and bind off loosely with this stitch because there's a lot of stretch to it. It makes a fabric that really grows, so you need to make sure that your cast on edge and bind off edge stretch with the rest of the fabric. I'm going to start this stitch from the cast on because there is a setup row that you need to do in order to start this stitch, and you want to work on an even number of stitches. When you're casting on for this stitch, I'm going to show you the way that I usually cast on when I need a loose cast on edge. You can use larger needles than you plan to use for your project, or I just cast on over 2 needles, and I have a separate video on this that goes a little slower. So I'm going to cast on an even number here. Okay, so this should be 12. Let me just double check. Okay, 12 stitches. Let me get my tail out of the way here. Okay. So now our setup row, we're going to slip a stitch and make a yarn over at the same time, and we're going to knit 1. So it's yarn over, slip 1, knit 1. And you want to grab your yarn and your slip stitch at the same time. You want to kind of work them together. These 2 stitches are going to be best friends, so they're always going to be together. And then you knit. Grab the yarn with your right needle so that you're slipping the next stitch while you're making the yarn over. You can see there how I have the yarn. And then knit 1. Grab the yarn with the needle and carry it over the needle at the same time you're slipping your stitch. And knit 1. Grab the yarn with your right needle and carry it over the needle at the same time you're slipping your stitch. And you're slipping purlwise, by the way. Knit 1. And knit the last stitch. That's just the setup row. You won't be working any more rows like that. The next row, which is the row that you will be repeating throughout, is kind of worked the same way, except you're knitting 2 together instead of just 1. So let's take a look at the stitches here for a minute so you can see what we have. From our setup row, this is the stitch that was knit, and then this is the stitch that was slipped with the yarn over. This is going to count as 1 stitch. The yarn over and the slipped stitch, these are always going to be counted as 1. You don't separate them. So if you count you should have the same number that you cast on with. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So while you're increasing with your yarn overs on that setup row, really your stitch count is going to be the same because you are counting the slipped stitch with the yarn over as one stitch. Let's do the next row of this pattern. And just like before, when you're slipping your stitch, we start with a slip stitch. You want to make sure that you're carrying your yarn over the needle at the same time you're slipping your stitch. So with your right needle, you just want to grab your yarn and then grab your stitch that you're going to slip. And then you're going to work your yarn over and its accompanying stitch together. You're going to knit them together. These are always going to be worked together. So with your right needle, you're going to grab your working yarn, carry it over the needle at the same time you're making your slip stitch. And then knit 2 together. So if you're a continental knitter like me, your yarn is always going to be in position to make your knit 2 together. You don't need to move the yarn. Just grab it with your right needle and pull it forward as you're slipping the stitch. And see, your yarn is already in position back here to make your knit 2 together. Grab the yarn with the right needle and carry it over the needle as you're slipping the stitch. Knit 2 together. So you're not making separate movements. You're not making a yarn over and then slipping a stitch. You're carrying the yarn over the needle at the same time you're making the slip stitch. It's one movement. And it's kind of awkward at first. But once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. It's like second nature. And the last 2 stitches on your needle, it's a yarn over and your slipped stitch from that setup row. And you're still going to work that together just like you have been doing. So right now, what you have is something that probably looks like this. And you're thinking, well, how do I get my stitch? It takes a few rows before you start to see the fabric. So you're just going to keep going, slipping and knitting 2 together, and eventually you will see the pattern. Now all you're doing is repeating that same row over and over. You want to have your yarn over your needle at the same time you're slipping, and then knit 2 together. So you have a single stitch and a double stitch. You want to give your single stitch a friend. So you grab the yarn, carry it over the needle, and slip your single stitch. Then you want to separate your double stitch here by turning him into one. So now your single stitch is locked in place with his new yarn over friend, and the stitch that was a yarn over and slip stitch is now one stitch. And we still have something that looks kind of strange on the needles. Still not quite looking like anything. I promise, if you keep working the stitches, you will see the pattern. Let me see if I can do this for you English style, which I'm not very good at. So again, you want to make sure that your yarn is in the front. And you want to slip your stitch. I'm going to put my needle into the two that I'm going to work together. You're going to bring your yarn between the needles, yarn forward, slip a stitch, knit the next two together, yarn comes forward, the slip, work the next two together, the yarn over and slip stitch from the previous row. Okay. Let's see if I can do that again. One more time for the throwers. So yarn is in the front of your work. You want to put it over the needle. Slip your first stitch. Work the next two together. Yarn comes forward. Slip. Work the next two together. My end is a little messed up there. Okay. Okay, so still, it doesn't look like very much. And you might be thinking that you've done something wrong, but if you look closely, you can see that it's starting to resemble the brioche stitch. Let me just do a row one more time. So it's yarn over at the same time you're slipping a stitch. Knit 2 together. Yarn over and slip. Knit 2 together. Yarn over and slip. Knit 2 together. So if you like brioche knitting and you're interested in learning more about it, I would recommend Nancy Marchant's book on brioche knitting. I'll put a link below the video here so you can see her book. And she also has a class over on Craftsy that you might want to check out if you are interested in brioche knitting. So that's it. Just keep working in that manner. See, it's starting to look a little more like something here. Alright, so you can see that my fabric actually looks like brioche stitch now. And this is just so soft and squishy. And I want to show you the bind off, because as I mentioned, you need to make sure that your cast on and bind off edges are very loose and stretchy so that they can move with the rest of your fabric here. And I'm just going to do a regular standard bind off, and you can use a needle that is larger than the one you've been working with. If you used a larger needle to cast on, you can use that same one to do your bind off. And I'm going to omit the yarn overs when I'm doing my bind off row, but I'm going to work it almost the same way that I've been working my stitch. I'm going to knit my first stitch here. And then remember, your yarn over and slipped stitch, those are going to count as one stitch. So you want to make sure that you're working those together on your bind off row, just like you've been doing throughout the stitch pattern. So work those two together, and then just pass your first stitch over like you would for a regular standard bind off. So knit the next stitch, and again do this very loosely. Okay, we have a double stitch next. You want to make sure that you work those together. Sometimes that single stitch will hide behind the slipped stitch and the yarn over. So you want to be careful that you are working the stitches correctly. You might need to pull them apart a little bit. Last stitch, you would cut your yarn and weave in your tail. That is how to knit the brioche stitch.